So the structure of this course is, I think, very importantly, before we get into all the nits and grits about the Rivonia trial and the legal aspects of the trial, maybe just to get our heads around what was going on before 1963 when they were arrested. What was the politics, what was the society, what were the issues that led to this change from the Defiance campaign being the peaceful protests to the acts of sabotage being the bombings of buildings and being and leading to the armed wings of the PAC being Poko and of ANC being Mkhonto we Sizwe. So I think just before we even get there, I think it would be very useful for us to backtrack and say, okay, what were the laws? What informed this kind of behavior? What was the progression leading up to here? So what I think I'd just like to do is maybe just do a brief summary of the cornerstone foundation laws, the cornerstone apartheid laws that were the foundation of apartheid. And maybe, and as soon as we do that, we can discuss what would have been the primary grievances of people, you know, what would have been the issues, what have been the concerns, what is leading to the marches, what is leading to the protests. And then thereafter, we've actually got a very interesting documentary of that time before 1960 that we can have a look at, and then we'll have a homework assignment coming out of that. So that's the structure of today's session. Okay, but please, as we go along, I'm learning, and so I'd love if you guys have your own thoughts to contribute. I mean, a lot of our learning comes from each other, and each other being our past experiences. I mean, if having all of us coming from different places of South Africa, we'll have our own our own personal stories of what apartheid meant to our parents, to our grandparents. For example, if last week we talked about where we were from, where our grandparents were from, some places I'd never heard of. And so obviously they would have had different experiences, but very important experiences. And I think if we can bring in those stories here, that will just make our learning so much more fulfilling. Okay, so let's start with 1948. I think if you just go to your timeline, you'll see what we said, that the National Party wins the general election under Malan and begins to implement apartheid. And so as I said, I think maybe we'll just go through the key laws and I'll say a few sentences on them. There's a document in there called Security Legislation that lists some of the laws, the security laws. But of course there were more than what's listed there. So I'll just maybe write down a few before we get into our movie. Is that good? Pardon?
The other handout you did on security legislation, I just copied.
Oh, okay, sorry. So they won't be there. Sorry about that. So you will get it. Yeah. But I'll keep this very simple. If you want to take notes, you can. But I think it's more important just to listen. Okay. So let's start with the population registration. And if you guys have heard of these, maybe you can just add what you know. Okay, so we can keep this interactive, we can keep this discussion going. Excuse my writing, I write like a doctor. So the Population Registration Act, what this act, the crux of the act was basically requiring all South Africans to register themselves according to race. So you had your black, white, Indian, Asian. Mm-hmm. And very interesting for me is the way that they classified the races. So white would be on appearance, or what is believed to what is believed to be white, and that would be informed by the way people carried themselves. It was very subjective. Subjective meaning like it's not obvious. You have to. Any person can kind of decide for themselves. It's not subjective opposite of subjective is objective. So whereas objective is easily determined, subjective is not. It kind of like depends on various things. So, I mean, for example, I don't know if you guys have heard of the pencil test. Yeah. Do you want to tell?
It's basically when I think the easiest way to explain is to most people have afro,
Mhm.
so it's kind of kinky. So if you put on a pencil, it's not easy for it to just come through. But if you have silky hair, which is white hair, it just goes straight right through.
Yeah. So that was one of the crazy tests that they had to determine, especially with colored people, if somebody was white. To say, well, if can a pencil go through their hair? Well, then I guess maybe then they'll be white. So it was just a very random, crazy classification. Looking back now, I say that, but I guess at the time, that was something that you had to identify yourself with and classify yourself. And because it's not always obvious, especially given the history of some people. I mean, Zaki was saying where his heritage is. He's got, a whole lot, what he's from, his grandparents, Indian, German, so much. And so for one day, somebody just say, actually, you are in that box. So that's why they came up with these muddle tests. So there was that act. And then we've got the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act. Mixed Marriages Act. I think this one is quite straightforward, hey? But does anyone want to just maybe give us one line of your interpretation of it or an example of how it would affect people? Okay, well, basically, the law, this act was passed basically to say that black and white people can't marry, all right? Immorality Act, this was actually before 1948, before Verwoerd came into power, the Immorality Act. But what this act did now in 1952 was to extend to say that there can't be any immoral acts being, for example, adultery or any intercourse outside of marriage between not only black people, but extending it also to Indians and coloreds and Asian people, not with white people. So that's what the act did at that time. The Suppression of Communism Act was a huge one. And this is something that's going to come up when we talk more about the Rivonia trial. The Suppression of Communism Act, basically what it did was, firstly, well, quite clearly, is it outlawed communism. But communism was defined so broadly that it kind of basically just banned anything that called for radical change. So that's what that act did. Group Areas Act has often been called the cornerstone of apartheid because that's essentially the act that pushed people aside physically, geographically. And I think for me, what's always interesting is to look at how cities are still separated now. Your dominantly white areas, dominantly colored areas, dominantly black areas. It comes from these acts from back in the day. And interesting with this act is even before that, in 1913, there was the Land Act, the Black Land Act, which what it did, this is also on your timeline, what it did was it gave 7% of the land to black people who at the time were 67% of the population. So that was just crazy how they got to that number and thought that they'd be able to what's the word I'm looking for? Economically, that the country would be able to thrive economically with giving this much land with the worst kind of land at the time as well, being land that was unproductive for farming and so forth. And then there was a Separate Amenities Act. That's the act that allowed to say blacks only and whites only in public spaces, so your benches, your beaches, your hospitals, or wherever you needed separate entrances and so forth. Of course, big one, Bantu Education Act. And then also your pass laws. So the Bantu Education Act, does anyone know any detail about that act? I'm sure we've all heard about Bantu education, especially thinking about 1976 and the Soweto riots and yes.
Okay, what I know about education, that learners were learning Afrikaans,
Mhm.
and yeah, that's what I had.
Okay. So when this act was passed at the time, what Verwoerd was being very, very tricksy with what he wanted to do here, was he said that, what's the point of black people learning things that they won't be able to use? They're going to aspire to these jobs that they can't have. All they must know is to have these labor type jobs in their homelands. So what Bantu Education Act did was it separated education that black people would receive to a much lower class and quality of education. So the types of jobs that people could get would be, to be domestic workers, to work on farms, and that kind of education that you couldn't even dream of being an engineer, for example, because that wouldn't have been the education we've been receiving. And also, what it did was it banned black people from universities, particularly UCT and WITS, where they had previously had entrance. I'm sure you guys have come across, for example, Mandela went to WITS, and last week. Zaki mentioned that he actually had studied with one of his co-accused, was it Dennis? Oh, sorry. No, I was just explaining that before these acts were passed, you did have black and white people at the same universities. Yeah. And then there was the pass laws, obviously. Do you have a question?
No, I wanted to ask about that as I said, that back then the Bantu education wanted black people to be taught in Afrikaans, but wouldn't that would have been an advantage to them being taught in Afrikaans, looking at we were facing apartheid that time? So if we were like to be taught in Xhosa during that time, where were you going to work? Who were you going to be able to communicate with? Will it be having Afrikaans in addition to your languages that you know and be able to work with those white people and whereby you're able to communicate with them?
Sure, I just wanted to add one comment and you can add on top of that. In terms of, for me, I would have taken issue with that because of the choice. It's different when you are given the option to study something as we have now at schools, and where you're forced to take it when you haven't even spoken it your whole life, because what it's designed to do is to make you fail, right? How are you going to write your matric in Afrikaans when you've never studied it from grade 1? So I think that was the kind of issue. If it would, I'm sure it would have been beneficial if you now go into the working space and your colleagues are Afrikaans and you can engage with them on that level. But going back to why it was enforced was the issue. But you can add.
I'd like some time to look at what the Bantu Education Act did. One of the things it did was it said it forced all primary school education to be mother tongue medium only. And then if you went to high school, suddenly, 1 year, you changed from learning all your subjects through the medium of Sesotho or Zulu or whatever. The next year, everything is English medium. And so a lot of people dropped out at that level. You see? So it was maths in mother tongue and so on. And then suddenly, from one day to the next, it was English medium. The thing about Afrikaans medium was only enforced. They tried to enforce it in the middle 70s. And that's what sparked 76. It was there on the books, but they never forced it. They suddenly said half the subjects must be taught through the medium of Afrikaans. So you really had to do maths and geography in Afrikaans. Suddenly, they were threatening that, and that's what sparked it. But that wasn't always the case.
Yeah, good question. Okay, and there was the pass laws. I'm sure we've heard of these, hey? Dompasses, you know, and then the Unlawful Organizations Act. That was passed actually the week after the Sharpeville massacre. So we've all heard of Sharpeville, the Sharpeville massacre. Does anyone want to say just maybe 2 lines about it? It's also on our timeline here, 1960. Okay, so what this act did was, as soon as the Sharpeville massacre occurred, the week after, this act was passed, and it immediately banned the PAC and the ANC. Okay, so I think with that background, maybe we can go into discussion of the type of grievances that you would have maybe experienced in your daily life, having lived under these acts. Maybe you can just discuss with the person sitting next to you what grievances, personal issues, obstacles, barriers would have led to protests, to marches, to acts of violence. So yeah, let's just maybe take 5 minutes to have that discussion with the person next to you.